Who was here for our opening ceremonies yesterday for the Senior Olympics? A lot of you were. We had so much fun, and we have a couple more weeks to go. And in preparation for our Senior Olympic celebration, we thought, wouldn't it be fun to have a special history program about the Olympics? And I couldn't find anyone that was advertising that they were doing it, but I reached out to our favorite historian, and he said, I'll put something together for you. So I'm so grateful. And thank you very much, Paolo. Welcome. He's going to do the 5 rings, a brief history of the modern Olympics. Thank you.
Excellent. How is everybody doing today? Are we ready to work up a sweat? Yes. It is great to be here with you as you delve into your own Olympic Games here in Walpole. We are going to dive into the history of the modern Olympic Games, something that we're all familiar with, a celebration of sport, of athleticism, a celebration of many, many different things, of cultures, of ideas that we have every 4 years, every 2 years. Consider the Winter Olympics also, and I'll talk about the Winter Olympics later on. But the idea of the Olympics, the modern Olympics, are relatively new. The modern games, as we think of them, are only 130 years old, almost 130 years old at this point. They are the product of wealthy Europeans at the end of the 19th century. And I'll mention a few of those along the way. But what are the origins of the Olympics? What is the actual story of the Olympic Games themselves? Where do they begin? In Greece. The ancient Olympics. The ancient Olympic Games played a very important role in Greek society, in Greek culture, in Greek history. For about 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, every 4 years, roughly every 4 years, these Olympic events, these games were held in the town of Olympia in northwestern Greece. It was there where there was a cult to the chief of the Greek gods, Zeus. The Olympic Games begin as a religious festival in honor of Zeus, the chief of the Greek gods. Now, in the Greek world, athletic competitions were very common. Religious festivals often had a component of athletic competition, foot races, seeing who could throw a rock the furthest, that sort of thing. It was part and parcel of the entire worship, of the entire religious aspect of the Greek world. What made the Olympic Games, the ones in Olympia, the ones dedicated to Zeus, so significant is that they really dominated Greek society, Greek politics, and even Greek warfare. The original Olympic Games, the first ones, the first religious festival held in honor of Zeus, were held in 776 BC. And that was essentially a one-day religious festival where participants from around Greece went to the temple of Zeus, they worshipped, and they had some foot races and some wrestling competitions. The winners of those wrestling competitions were not really given any prizes other than the esteem of having won the competition. You won the foot race. Everybody cheer for you. Yay. It was kind of a way of bolstering your reputation among the other competitors and among the people of the various city-states of Greece. But as these games develop, and they were held every 4 years, a 4-year period that was called an Olympiad, they grow in importance. More events are added. The length of the festival increases from a single day to several days to about a week in length. And the Olympic Games, the ancient Olympics, become so significant that the Greeks themselves agree that even if we're in the midst of fighting a war, if the Olympic Games are going on, we will put down our weapons. We will have a temporary truce during that period in which these games dedicated to Zeus are being held. So we have to remember that modern Greece, as we think of it as one nation, is relatively young. It was only created in the beginning of the 19th century, around 1822, 1831, somewhere in there. Ancient Greece was tremendously fragmented. Lots of different city-states, Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Ithaca and all of those places. And they were all rivals with one another and often at war with one another. There was a lot of political and social turmoil in the ancient world. Yet they did have these moments of peace that coincided every 4 years with the Olympic Games themselves, with these athletic traditions. Here we see some depictions of Olympic athletes, runners competing in a foot race, wrestlers. In that bottom image, there's the two men wrestling in the middle and the two other guys on the side. Those are referees. They were armed with a long stick. And if they saw either of the wrestlers kind of breaking the rules, and the rules were pretty simple, don't gouge your opponent's eyes out, they would hit you with the stick to make you stop. Then over there we have the discus thrower. That statue is a famous Roman copy of a Greek original. It was another one of the important events that evolved in the ancient Olympic Games. Now, there is a commonality among all of the events that were held in the ancient Olympics. You had things like running and wrestling and eventually boxing and the throwing of the discus and the throwing of a spear or a javelin and eventually chariot races. What do they all have in common? They were all aspects of warfare. It was essentially a military competition that was done under a religious guide that wasn't meant to lead to the loss of life. I'm stronger than you. I'm a better soldier than you, a better fighter than you because I defeated you in this boxing match or this wrestling match, or I can throw the discus farther than you can, or I can throw the javelin farther than you can. Things that were important in war also translated to the entertainment of the Greeks, to the games that were being held in Olympia. Even after the Roman conquest of Greece, the Romans embraced a lot of aspects of Greek culture. They borrow all the Greek gods. They add on to some of the Greek myths. The Romans continued the process of the Olympic Games. Every 4 years, they had these festivals. Now, the Romans had a different conception of competition, however. To the Greeks, what was being done at the Olympic Games was a competition among equals. It was us competing for honor, for glory, for a laurel wreath, that sort of stuff. To the Romans, athletic competitions became entertainment. And you had athletes who trained for these specific events who would win the admiration of the crowd, and they became kind of public heroes, public figures. But despite that different interpretation of what the games meant, the religious aspects still remained, and the games themselves continued well into the 4th century. What comes along in the 4th century in the Roman world, however, to end the games? I'll give you a hint. It was a religion. Christianity. Those early Christians were, frankly, no fun. And they didn't like the Greek games. They didn't like the Olympic Games because they were too closely associated with the worship of Zeus. So when Christianity gets established in the Roman Empire, that essentially brings an end to the Greek games sometime around 393, there at the end of the 4th century. So you do have this roughly 1,000-year period where these ancient games were held there in Greece to honor Zeus. That comes to an end in the late Roman period there with the advent of Christianity. And then for the next, got to do the math, 1,600 years or so, the Olympics don't exist. There was not an organized athletic competition of this caliber, of this type, that develops anywhere in the world. Now, there are athletics being competed in different parts of the world, different games, different sports. I mean, the simplest thing to do is to line a couple people up and run down a certain distance to know who's the fastest. That was certainly taking place. Games with balls were taking place. Games with horses and animals were taking place. But it wasn't the Olympics. Those events were all more localized. They were all more specialized. They were very, very different. And it isn't until the 19th century, after the independence of Greece, Greece was once part of the Ottoman Empire, it gains its independence by about 1831, that the idea of a revival of the Olympic Games begins to circulate. It is an idea that begins in Greece, but soon spreads to other parts of Europe. And that brings us to really the emergence of the modern games as we think of them. Now, who is credited today as being the father of the Olympic movement? You might not know offhand, but you probably heard the name. Pierre de Coubertin and his magnificent mustache. Pierre de Coubertin was a French nobleman, an educator. His family wanted him to go and be a soldier, but he didn't really want to be a soldier. He was a student of classical antiquity, a student of different philosophies of education. And in the late 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, he starts to have a correspondence with an English doctor, an English physician named Dr. William Penny Brooks. Brooks had developed this idea for an athletic competition to be held in London, a competition where the greatest athletes from around the British world would come and compete against one another there in London. And in fact, he holds an Olympic-style games in 1866. It is met with tremendous success in London. Lots of people go to watch these athletic events. But when Brooks tried to stage a second edition of those, they were less popular. And the financial issues emerge, and essentially the idea of this Olympic-style competition in London dies very quietly, very suddenly. But Brooks was a proponent of the idea of having this big athletic competition that represented people from different walks of life from different parts of Europe, where they could compete against one another. And in fact, Coubertin goes to London and talks with Brooks. Now, Coubertin had gone there to talk about educational philosophy. Brooks starts rambling on about athletic competitions. But Coubertin is certainly inspired by that. And when he returns to Paris, he meets with leading sports figures in France and begins to propose this idea of some sort of international athletic competition that would be a way of bringing people from around the world together, that would be a way of celebrating the idea of sport, that would be a way of celebrating the idea of peace. So Coubertin starts to digest the idea that Brooks had. Now, Brooks himself might have been inspired by some Greeks. Funny that there were Greeks at the beginning of the Olympic Games. In 1859, a revival of the Greek Olympics took place there in Olympia in Greece. It was an event organized by a man named Evangelos Zappas, who had been inspired by a Greek poet from the 1830s, right at that period of Greek independence. The poet's name was, I'm going to massacre the name, so please forgive me, Panagiotis Sotis. This Greek poet, inspired by the tales of classical antiquity, proposes we should revive the Greek games, the Olympic Games. Zappas embraces that idea in 1859, stages a revival of the Greek games. That inspires Brooks. Brooks then goes on to inspire Coubertin, and Coubertin then announces in Paris, hey, we should do this. And he ends up with all the credit for creating the modern Olympics, though he was certainly basing his ideas on other people. So an idea begins to circulate, an International Olympic Committee is set up, and in 1896, the first modern Olympic Games are held. Now, where are those games held? In Greece, in Athens. Now, the fact that the games were held in Athens certainly is appropriate because Greece was the birthplace of the Olympic Games. The location, the venue in which the games were held, which we see right here, was the ancient athletics stadium in Athens that had recently been restored by archaeologists. So it was a fitting place in which to house these games, in which to have this athletic competition. So the first modern Olympiads are called to order there in Athens in 1896. There were a total of 241 participants in the Olympic Games, that first one, representing 12 or 14 countries, depending on how we want to categorize the countries. They competed in 43 events. Most of the competitions took place here in and around Athens in the stadium that we see right there. There is a booklet of the first Olympic Games held in Athens in 1896. Now, who was not allowed to participate in the first Olympic Games? Women. So it was all men competing there in Athens in 1896. Women, however, would be allowed to compete the following Olympics held in Paris in 1900. So by 1900, there are women competing in the Olympics in events like archery and stuff like that. So the first Olympiads, the revival of the idea of the Olympics, takes place here in Athens with the first games. Now, Paris, 1900, big deal in Paris. There was also an international exposition being held in Paris in 1900 that kind of overshadowed the games. So you had some athletic competitions going on over here and then the celebration over there. 4 years later, the games are held for the first time in the United States in 1904. Where were the 1904 games held? Not New York. No, not Los Angeles either. St. Louis. St. Louis, Missouri. Why would you have the Olympics in St. Louis, Missouri? Well, as it happened in 1904, there was another big celebration taking place in St. Louis. It was the centennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So there was the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exhibition being held in St. Louis, a World's Fair. The World's Fair actually had center stage. The Olympics were brought to St. Louis because that would be kind of a nice addition to the World's Fair. So you end up having the Olympic Games as a secondary event occurring there in St. Louis. Now, the thing about the St. Louis Games is that there were several global factors that limited international participation. This was the year that the Russo-Japanese War broke out, a major war between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire. That dissuaded many athletes from leaving Europe to come to the United States. Another issue was that St. Louis is kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of the United States. It's not easy to get to if you're taking a boat from Europe to the East Coast or taking a boat from Asia to the West Coast. You still have to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to get to St. Louis. So there weren't a lot of participants, international participants at the game. In fact, about 80% of the athletes at the St. Louis Games were from the United States, and about half of the remaining athletes were from Canada. So the international aspect certainly wasn't there. Now, the St. Louis Games is significant in the history of the Olympics for a couple of reasons. This was the first time that medals were awarded to the top three participants: gold, silver, and bronze. The first time that happens is here at St. Louis in 1904. It was also an Olympic Games, as I said, was overshadowed by the exhibition next door. People were coming to St. Louis to see that, not necessarily the games. And sometimes people that were in St. Louis to participate in the World's Fair decided, I'm going to go run the race over there in the Olympics. So it was very informal and very disorganized. And it was also, in 1904, the site of one of the more memorable Olympic marathons. Excuse me. The 1904 Olympic Marathon could best be described as a disaster. There were 32 participants that started the race. Only 14 of them finished. It was run on a hot 90-degree day, and most of the race took place on dusty roads outside of St. Louis, outside of the Olympic Park. As the race was going on, you had people on motorcycles or people in carriages leading the way for the runners, kicking up clouds of dust. So imagine you're a participant there at the 1904 Olympics. You're running essentially in a cloud of dust in this staggering heat. You're breathing in the dust. It's sticking to you, caking to your sweat. Very, very unpleasant. Now, at the time, the distance for the marathon had not yet officially been set. So the St. Louis Olympic Marathon was only 24.7 miles, a mile and a half shorter than the current marathon distance. But as the race was taking place, as these athletes headed out, they would find only 2 water stations along the 25-mile route. So 90-degree day, dusty, hot, only 2 water stations. Now, why were there only 2 water stations? That was on purpose, because one of the race organizers had theories about athletic participation and dehydration. And he wanted to test those theories on the athletes there running the marathon. So he believed that you could kind of will yourself to finish a marathon without ever taking in any water. That has tragic consequences. In any case, the race begins. These 32 men head out into the dust. And then the race gets even weirder. About 9 miles into the race, one of the competitors, a man named Fred Lortz, drops out. He's vomiting. He's ill. He feels really awful, kind of to be expected. And he is picked up by a passing automobile and rides with the automobile for about 11 miles toward the finish line. At that point, he decided, I'm feeling pretty good. So he jumps out of the car and runs to the Olympic Stadium, crossing the finish line first. He is cheered by the spectators. He is given an award for his participation before it quickly becomes apparent that, hey, he didn't actually run the entire race. So he is disqualified. There's no word if he actually ever gave back his medal, however. So he's disqualified. That means that the person who finished in second, a man named Thomas Hicks, an American named Thomas Hicks, actually ends up winning the race. He is the official winner of the marathon. Hicks had a miserable time running the marathon in St. Louis, as you might imagine. Partway through the race, he starts hallucinating. He is slowing down. He is feeling really bad. And his coaches and his supporters go out and they start to ply him with egg whites to ingest, to give him energy. Now remember, there was nothing to drink along the course. So he is being given egg whites. The egg whites themselves were laced with strychnine. Strychnine, of course, could be used as a rat poison, but it also has the effects of kind of an amphetamine. It could be an energy boost in small quantities. So here you have Thomas Hicks running this race, nearly dead. His buddies come along, which you see going on right over here, come along, and they're plying him with all of this essentially performance-enhancing substances. So he brightens up, he recovers a little bit, he's continuing to the finish line, and then again, he starts to feel really, really bad. His buddies come out, they're wiping him down with a wet sponge to keep him cool because he can't drink any water, and then they eventually give him a cocktail of brandy, egg whites, and strychnine to fortify him so that he could finish the race. Well, he does eventually finish the race looking pretty miserable, as you might imagine, nearly dead by the time he gets to the finish line, but he does win the Olympic marathon of that year. Now, there are two other participants, these two men over here on the lower right, Len Tanyani and Jen Mashayani, who were the first Africans to compete in the Olympic Games. They were actually at the World's Fair, the exhibition that was being held in St. Louis. They were part of a so-called human zoo. They were, on exhibit because they were part of the British Empire. They were from South Africa, but they wandered over to the marathon and they end up running the race. Both of them finish it, though Tanyani actually is chased off course by a pack of dogs at one point during the race. So he has to escape the dogs before making his way back to finish the marathon. And then there's another participant in the race, a Cuban mailman who raised money to get to St. Louis by running across the island of Cuba. So he is kind of this favorite son of Cuba. He makes his way across Cuba, raises money, buys a ticket to the United States, and sails from Cuba to New Orleans. Well, what happens when he gets to New Orleans? He promptly gambles all his money away. So he ends up having to hitchhike and walk from New Orleans to St. Louis to participate in the marathon. When he arrives there, he's only got one suit of clothing, the suit that he was wearing on his voyage, a formal suit with jacket and long pants and a vest and that sort of thing. And here he is, 90-degree day, preparing to run the marathon. Well, right before the start of the race, a spectator chops off the legs of his pants so that he is running in shorts. I don't think I have a picture of him here for some reason. And he ends up running the race in his formal attire with the cut-off pants. Now, he was an interesting character because he was loquacious. He was very friendly. And along the route, he stopped to talk to spectators, to chat with people. He ate some peaches along the way. And at one point, he stops to pick apples at an apple orchard. As it turns out, those apples were rotten. So he ends up feeling ill and decides, I'm going to take a nap. And he lays down by the side of the road and takes a nap. By the time his nap ends, he wakes up, he's feeling better, he finishes the race and finishes in fourth place. So you have this sort of stuff that is remarkable in this marathon. There is another unfortunate figure in the 1904 marathon, a runner named Felix Garcia, who nearly dies of dehydration and internal damage from breathing in the dust. In fact, he collapses on the course, is rushed to the hospital where he's pumped full of water, of liquids, and he is suffering from a dust-lined esophagus and a torn stomach lining as a result of breathing in all of that dust. It was a chaotic race, a disastrous race in many ways, but certainly a memorable Olympic marathon race that is run there in St. Louis in 1904. Things can only get better from this point on, right? Hopefully. So we're going to jump from 1904. We'll jump forward 8 years to the Olympics in 1912, which were held in Stockholm, Sweden. And there in Stockholm, an American athlete named Jim Thorpe becomes a sensation. This is Jim Thorpe over here. Jim Thorpe wins the decathlon and the pentathlon. The decathlon, of course, a track and field event that had 10 separate events as components of it. The pentathlon, track and field event that had 5 separate components to it. He wins both of those events. And when he is on the medal stand receiving his medal from the King of Sweden, Gustav V, and we see that happening over there, the king supposedly says to him, "You, sir, are the greatest athlete in the world." Legend has it that Jim Thorpe responded, "Thanks, King." Whether or not he actually said that is debatable. But Jim Thorpe here in 1912 was at the peak of his power, the peak of his fame, the greatest athlete in the world. But what happens to Jim Thorpe? He loses his medals. His medals are stripped away from him later in 1912 because it is discovered that he had actually played semi-pro baseball and had been paid for that, which disqualified him as an amateur, and he was forced to return his medals. The medals, Jim Thorpe's medals, would eventually be restored to his family in like 1990-something after his death. But his medals that he won there in 1912 were restored to him, and his place as the champion of those events was secured by that. So we have Jim Thorpe here in 1912. Now, the Olympics in 1916 were scheduled to be in Berlin. They did not happen because of the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The First World War really challenged many of the ideals of the Olympic movement. It was meant to be a celebration of humanity, a celebration of athleticism, a moment of international peace. But when the war breaks out in 1914 and stretches on for 4 years until 1918, 1919, that notion of global peace really does suffer. The Olympics will not be back until 1920. That is when the next Olympic game is held. And then in 1924, a decision was reached. You know, these games, they're all summer events, or mostly summer events. There was actually ice hockey being played at the early summer games and figure skating at some of the early summer games. But it was decided in 1924 that we should have a showcase for winter sports. So what we see is that in January of 1924, the first Winter Olympic Games are held in Chamonix, France. This would become a tradition. Every 4 years, we would have the Winter Olympics. Here you see some of the scenes from that first Winter Olympics. The image there on the right is the athletes taking the Olympic oath. That is the opening ceremony of the first Winter Olympic Games. Here you see, anybody know what that sport is there at the top? Curling. Still played in the Olympics, still oddly fascinating to watch in the Olympics. And here we have an early bobsled race. No safety precautions, no aerodynamics. That was a dangerous occupation to have. So it's in 1924 that the story of the Winter Olympics itself begins. Incidentally, it was 1924 where an 11-year-old Sonja Henning first participates in the Olympics. As a little child. She would become, of course, a massive figure in figure skating over the course of her career. So the Winter Olympics held in Chamonix, the Summer Olympics in 1924 held in Paris for the second time. So Paris becomes the first city to repeat as a host of the Olympic Games. Now, the Paris Olympics are particularly notable because of the participation of 2 British athletes, the 2 men we see here on the screen, Harold Abrahams and Eric Liddell. Does anybody know those names? Chariots of Fire. If you remember the movie from 1981, Chariots of Fire, I can hum the theme song if it helps refresh your memory. That is the story of these 2 British athletes in their struggle to win gold medals there in Paris in 1924. So one of the reasons why we think about the 1924 Olympics today certainly is because of that movie from 1981 with that dramatic theme song and the guys running along the beach at the beginning of the movie. That is the story of these 2 British athletes. So Paris, 1924, we start the Winter Olympics. We have the Chariots of Fire Olympics there in Paris. Then 1928, we have another Olympics, but we're going to skip 1928 because we are heading to one of the games that really transformed the entire notion of the Olympics, an Olympic event that was marked by political posturing, that would have dramatic entrances, dramatic kind of set pieces, a games that really transformed how later Olympics would be staged, how they would be held. That was the games held in Berlin in 1936. Now, the Berlin Games are sometimes called Hitler's Olympics because they were served as a propaganda stage for Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany at that time. When Berlin was awarded those games, however, in 1932, it was before Hitler had come to power. And the reason why Berlin was awarded the games was kind of as a way of bringing Germany back into the fold in Europe after the First World War. Germany suffers tremendously after the First World War. They are forced to pay an indemnity. Their military is destroyed. They are essentially a pariah in European politics and European society. By the early 1930s, a move was made to reintegrate Germany into the European community. So they are awarded the games in 1936, for 1936. In 1933, of course, Hitler stages his coup d'etat, takes over Germany, imposes the Nazi regime on that country. So the Nazis used the Olympics in 1936 as a showplace, as a way of putting forth Nazi propaganda and Nazi ideology. There were many countries that thought about boycotting the 1936 Olympics because of the fate of German Jewish athletes and how they were being cast aside, how they were not allowed to participate in athletic games. So there was some concern about that, but ultimately Germany made enough concessions by allowing a couple of Jewish athletes to participate that the boycott never happens in 1936, and most of the countries around the world do go to participate there in Germany. Now, one of the reasons why the Berlin Games in 1936 are so influential is because of the stage setting. It was the opening ceremonies in particular were created to make an impression to all the viewers. Hitler does employ cinematographers and stage designers in creating what becomes the grand Olympic ceremony, the opening ceremony, held in the Olympic Stadium there in Berlin, which we see on that lower image. There were thousands of German citizens in attendance cheering Hitler when he walked into the building. And one of the most important aspects that is introduced at the Berlin Games in 1936 was the Olympic torch run, bringing a flame from Olympia in Greece to the site of the Olympic Games. That was an innovation introduced during the Nazi Olympics in 1933. It's something that has remained an important part of the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games, that torch run from Greece to wherever the games are being held. Now, Hitler had planned for this event to be a stage on which he could celebrate his theories of Aryan supremacy. He meant it to be a showplace where German athletes would be showing off their prodigious skills and their superiority to others. That plan falls apart. And it falls apart because of one American athlete, Jesse Owens, a young African-American, shows up in Berlin and dominates the games. He ends up winning 4 gold medals in the track and field competition, the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 relay. It is Jesse Owens that in many ways, through his athletic accomplishments at the Berlin game, ends up overshadowing Hitler, ends up overshadowing the Nazis and what they had hoped to do at that game. Jesse Owens becomes the name, the hero of the games. The German athletes kind of become secondary to his accomplishments. So a plan by the Nazis backfires because of one athlete, Jesse Owens. The 1940 Olympics were planned for Tokyo. Those don't happen because the Second World War breaks out in 1939. The 44 games were also canceled because of the Second World War. Those were supposed to be held in Rome. In fact, Mussolini had built a massive sports complex on the outskirts of Rome in anticipation of those games. They do not occur. So the Olympic ideal, the Olympic spirit, dies for about 12 years. It is subsumed in the turmoil of the Second World War. And it isn't until 1948 when the Olympic Games once again reemerge. They are held in London in 1948, and they are casually known as the Austerity Games. Why? Because London and England were in a period of economic decline and economic depression in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was a very, very difficult time in English society. There was not a lot of money to be spent, yet the games were going to be held there in London. It was, in a way, kind of a symbol of healing, the recovery from the Second World War, but it was a games that were held in very, very difficult financial situations for Britain and for the British Empire. Germany and Japan were not invited to participate in the 1948 games. The war had just ended. There were still some hard feelings there. The Soviet Union was invited, but chose not to send athletes. Instead, the Soviets sent observers to see what was going on with the games, to make a decision on if they wanted to participate the next time. So the 1948 games are really kind of a secondary status of Olympic Games just because of the situation in which they were staged, because of the political situation, the economic situation. It was a revival of the Olympic movement, a continuation of the Olympic movement, but the Games themselves were not necessarily a grand event just because of the context in which they were held. They do, however, mark the beginning of a new age in the Olympics, an age that would be dominated by geopolitical rivalry. The Cold War. The Cold War, of course, emerges as a rivalry between East and West, between the United States and the Soviet Union, each trying to outdo each other in terms of military power, in terms of the number of nuclear weapons they had, in terms of alliances, in terms of economics, who could get rockets into space first, all of that sort of stuff. And that geopolitical rivalry spilled over into sports. Sports becomes an aspect of soft power. If we can beat you in a game of whatever, then we're better than you. That was the idea. So both sides of the political divide in the Cold War begin to look at sports as a way of spreading ideology, of supporting their point of view. It becomes propaganda and sports and political power all wrapped into one. And of course, the Olympics, being the premier global sporting event, was an arena in which those rivalries, in which those competitions played out. Yet it wasn't always just the United States versus the Soviet Union or East versus West. That was an example of the tensions of the Cold War. In fact, if we were to look at the 1956 Olympics held in Melbourne, Australia, there is really a vivid, dramatic example of the passions that the Cold War could incite. The water polo tournament at the Melbourne Olympics was particularly brutal. Now, water polo is a nasty sport. It looks very nice, people swimming and chasing a ball and throwing a ball. But if you ever saw what was happening below the surface of the water in a water polo game, it is essentially a street fight. People clawing at each other, punching each other, pulling each other's bathing suits down. It can be very, very brutal below the surface. So the game itself is a rough game. But you add into that roughness the context in which the Melbourne Games were held. The Melbourne Games start in November of 1956. That's the summertime in Australia. And it was just weeks after the Soviet Union had invaded Hungary to suppress a rebellion in Hungary, a rebellion that was brutally put down by Soviet troops and Soviet tanks. The Hungarian water polo team had a natural rivalry against the Soviet water polo team. And those two teams end up meeting there in Melbourne at the Olympics. And what ensued was essentially a melee in the pool. Hard fouls, broken noses, lacerations. You have this famous image of one of the Hungarian players coming out of the pool after he had been punched in the head by a Soviet player with blood gushing from the wound. It was the brutality of the game itself was a symbol of the political passions aroused by the Cold War, by the uprising in Hungary that was brutally suppressed by the Soviets. So we see politics and nationalism and that sort of ideology making its way into the Olympic Games, particularly gruesomely here in the water polo competition in 1956. Well, 4 years later, the Olympics do finally arrive in Rome. The 1960 Games are held in Rome. Conveniently, Rome had a sports complex already constructed 20 years earlier by Mussolini. So the Rome Olympics are held in the complex that was constructed during the fascist era in Italy. And what we see in Rome is that several iconic athletes establish their reputations or begin their rise into public consciousness. You have Wilma Rudolph here in the center, who won the 100, 200, and 4x100 meter races on the track. Abibi Bikila over there, the Ethiopian marathoner, who wins the Rome Olympic Marathon, running barefoot on the streets, the cobblestone streets of Rome. He is the first African to win the marathon, opening the door for tremendous athletic success for African athletes. He would defend his title 4 years later in the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. In 64, he does run with shoes, however. And you also have the emergence of an American boxer, a light heavyweight known at that time as Cassius Clay, who would, within a few years, become perhaps the most famous, the most iconic athlete in the United States, Muhammad Ali, the perhaps greatest boxing champion in history. He begins his rise in the public eye. He essentially emerges on the public stage because of his gold medal victory there at the Rome Olympics. So Rome, the Olympics in Rome in 1960 are kind of a makeup Olympics for the one that was lost during the Second World War, but it created these iconic names, these iconic images that would loom large in the history of the Olympic movement, loom large in the history of sports and entertainment, well beyond the games themselves. So 1964, the games are held in Tokyo, again, kind of a redo from the games that were lost during the Second World War. And then in 1968, the games moved to Mexico City. Now, when you think of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, what image pops into your head? The protest by Tommy Smith and John Carlos on the medal stand after competing in the 200-meter race. They were protesting racial strife at home in the United States. Now, we have to think about 1968. It was a somewhat chaotic year in the United States. You had the Vietnam War increasing in scope. You have LBJ deciding not to seek a re-election as president, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, all of the turmoil that was present in American society, racial strife, the riots at the Chicago Democratic Nominating Convention. It was a tumultuous year in American society. And here you had two American athletes on the global stage protesting what they saw in the United States, the war, protesting racism, protesting the conditions in American society. It becomes one of the iconic images of the 1968 Olympics, one of the iconic images of the civil rights movement in the United States. For their public protest, the raising of the gloved fist, both athletes were shipped home. They were sent home from Mexico City to the United States. And many people still find this to be a tremendously controversial moment. Here they were when the national anthem was playing, and rather than celebrating that, they were protesting. We've heard stuff like that recently in the last few years at sporting events in the United States. The other significant event that occurs at Mexico City was there. Bob Beamon setting a world record in the long jump, a world record that would last until 1991. That record, 8.9 meters or 29 feet 2¼ inches, is still the Olympic record. Nobody has gotten close to that in the Olympics. Now, some people say that Beamon was able to jump so far because the games are held in Mexico City. Mexico City is at altitude with a thinner atmosphere, and perhaps he had less air resistance in his jump. Regardless, it was a world record long jump for more than 2 decades and still remains the Olympic record. What are we, 50-something years later? So it's an impressive achievement for Bob Beamon. So the Mexico City Games are successful in terms of the athletics, but there was turmoil around Mexico City. There were protests that were brutally suppressed by the Mexican government. There was bloodshed before the games began as riots were being put down. And that actually leads to a change in philosophy for the games that occurred 4 years later in 1972 in Munich. In Munich, the organizers did not want a repeat of what had happened in Mexico City with the rioting, with the violence, with the bloodshed in the streets. So they tried to minimize security. They spent less money on security than any previous Olympics had, or relatively recent previous Olympics had. The security that was there was often plainclothes. They were not armed. They were not confrontational. It was supposed to be a happy time Olympics, a good feeling Olympics, a time when, the games are back in Germany where they had been in 1936, and a way for Germany to kind of rebuild its reputation, if you will, from what had happened decades earlier. And what we see at Munich were remarkable athletic achievements. Mark Spitz, the American swimmer, ends up winning 7 gold medals. Mark Spitz was only 22 years old at the time, even though he looks like he's about 43 over here. You had Olga Korbut from the Soviet Union winning 3 gold medals in gymnastics. And you had Lassi Viren, the Finnish long-distance runner who set a world record in the 10-kilometer race while also winning the 5-kilometer race, which is a remarkable athletic feat. So you had tremendous athletic achievement, athletic accomplishment. The Munich Games seemed to be flourishing. They seemed to be prosperous. It seemed to be a celebration of peace and good times. But that peace and good times was shattered by tragedy in early September of 1972, when terrorists break into the Olympic Village and take Israeli athletes as hostages. A standoff ensues for about 24 hours. The hostages are being held. The pro-Palestinian terrorists are negotiating with the German police. The German police do try to launch a rescue mission. The police themselves are dressed in tracksuits, so they look like athletes. But the rescue mission doesn't work out, partly because it was being broadcast on television. And everybody in the Olympic Village was watching what the German police were doing. So images like that, as the police were trying to sneak into the athletes' village, everybody could see what was happening. So that rescue attempt is called off, and eventually negotiations do ensue with the terrorists. The terrorists want some Palestinian prisoners released, some communist prisoners released in Germany, and they demand a flight back to the Middle East. The authorities agree to give them to those demands. They agree to give them a flight back to the Middle East. The terrorists and the hostages are brought to an airport in Berlin, where a badly planned, poorly executed ambush ensues, leading to the death of 11 Israeli athletes, 5 terrorists, and 2 German police officers. The tragedy in Munich certainly had repercussions. The games were paused for about 36 hours before they were reinstituted. The head of the IOC, the American Avery Brundage, thought that the best thing that could happen was if the games continued as a way of kind of fighting back against terrorism. And that was a decision that faced a lot of criticism. People thought we should end the games. We had this tremendous tragedy. Why are we continuing at this pretended air of frivolity and carefreeness when you had this going on? But the tragedy certainly was palpable. It does linger still in the memory of the Olympics. After Munich, security does become one of the primary concerns in organizing and staging an Olympic Games wherever they are held anywhere in the world. So we see this tremendous tragedy in Munich. 4 years later, the Games come to Montreal, and they are held in Montreal. You can still go up and visit the Olympic Park in Montreal today. One of the arenas where the games were held then became the home field of the Montreal Expos, who departed Montreal in the early 21st century and moved to Washington, D.C. as the Nationals. After Montreal, however, that's when the games really kind of get interesting because of the politics that come into play. In 1980, the Winter Olympics were held in Lake Placid, New York. And what becomes the indelible image of the Lake Placid Olympics in 1980? Hockey. The so-called Miracle on Ice, when a group of young American college student hockey players end up defeating the powerful Russian Soviet hockey team. Now, the Soviets, though they were technically amateur, were really professional hockey players. They were some of the best hockey players in the world. The odds of the Americans beating the Soviets in 1980 were very, very long. Yet what happens? But the Miracle on Ice, you can all remember the famous radio call, "Do you believe in miracles?" as this ragtag group of Americans defeat the mighty Soviets. Now, that victory was in the semifinals. It was not the gold medal game, but it was to get to the gold medal game. The United States had to play one more game in order to win the gold medal. They do end up defeating Sweden in that gold medal game. So the United States wins the gold medal, Sweden wins the silver, and the Soviets end up with the bronze medal in 1980 in the Winter Olympics. Again, a hugely surprising moment, the longest of long shots, winning the game, winning the gold medal, a moment that really, again, exemplifies the geopolitical rivalry between East and West, between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was not supposed to happen, yet it happened. And it's a celebrated event across the United States. Now, that same year, 1980, the Summer Games were supposed to be in Moscow, or were going to be held in Moscow in the Soviet Union. Here we see pictures from the opening ceremony of the Moscow Games. The Moscow Olympics, however, become very much embroiled in international diplomacy and international politics. The prior year, 1979, the Soviet Union had launched an invasion of Afghanistan, ostensibly to support a communist regime that was there in Afghanistan. That ends up being a bad idea for the Soviet Union, but that comes a little bit later down the road. The invasion of Afghanistan caused tremendous turmoil on the global stage. Many countries, including the United States, were against the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, tried to use diplomacy to force the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was not going to leave. So as the Moscow Games are taking place, are beginning, heading toward taking place, heading toward the opening ceremonies, there is fierce debate in the United States of whether or not we should attend the games. Ultimately, Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, does decide that the United States will not be participating in the Moscow Olympics, and a boycott is launched. That boycott included many of our allies. Lots of countries decide not to participate in the games. Canada, Japan, they side with the United States. They boycott the games. Britain and France, they go their own way, and they do end up sending athletes to Moscow. But what we have in 1980 in the Moscow Games is very much not a full representation of athleticism, athletic prowess around the globe, because the United States does make this statement and does boycott it. I do have a personal connection with the Moscow Olympics. I was not there, but my college track coach was a participant in the games. He was from Venezuela and ran the 800 meters and ran several races there in Moscow in 1980. And he also participated in the games in Los Angeles in 1984. So I do have some ties with the Olympics here in Moscow. And that does bring us to 1984, when the games were held in Los Angeles and were in many ways the games of Hollywood. The opening ceremonies of the Los Angeles Games were a Technicolor spectacle with celebrities and fireworks and all sorts of drama and color. We see some of the opening ceremonies over there. The games themselves proved to be a gold rush for the United States. American athletes swept the podiums in many of the events. The American athletes won gold in a lot of the events. Why? The Soviets boycotted. as did many of the Eastern Bloc countries. Now, the Soviet Union said that they feared for the safety of their athletes, and that's why they were boycotting. But in reality, it was probably just payback for the United States not going to the Moscow Games in 1980. The only Soviet Bloc country that did attend the Olympics in Los Angeles was Romania. And the Romanian gymnasts had a wonderful success in the gymnastics part of the competition. However, who ends up winning the all-around gold in the Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984? Mary Lou Retton, whose face then graced all the boxes of Wheaties for the next few years. The Olympics in Los Angeles were also significant because Carl Lewis, the track star, matched the accomplishment of Jesse Owens. He too won 4 gold medals in the 1984 games. We also, in 1984, have the first event, the first women's marathon in the Olympics. It was the first time women ran the marathon in the Olympic competition. That was won by a local kid, Joan Benoit. She was the first champion of the women's Olympic marathon, a race that was held under stiflingly hot conditions, probably echoing what was going on in 1904, but without the strychnine and all the dust. In fact, one of the athletes, a Swiss marathon runner whose name escapes me, ended up staggering into the stadium at the end of the race, disoriented and kind of wobbling and zigzagging along the track, barely on her feet. And when she got to the finish line, actually finishing the race, she just collapsed into a heap because of the heat and the difficulty of running in those conditions. So the Los Angeles Games were a showcase of American athletic prowess, I guess we could say. 4 years later, in 1988, the games were held in Seoul, South Korea. And this is really the first time since the games in 1976 where you had a full complement of athletes from around the globe. The United States was there, the Soviet Union was there, the Eastern Bloc was there, our allies were there. It was really the first global Olympics in since Montreal. The Seoul Games were spectacular. There were world records that were set. There were remarkable athletic accomplishments that were held there. Florence Griffith Joyner over there on the right sets the world record for women in the 100 meters, a record that still lasts today. What are we, 27 years later? So that world record still, that's not right. We're not 27 years later. 37 years later, that record is still intact. The Seoul Games also, however, had a moment of shame and controversy when Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson, who we see over here, he wins the gold medal in the 100 meters in record time. He runs faster than any man had ever run. But he ends up failing a drug test. He was accused of using anabolic steroids that allowed him to run so fast, and his gold medal was stripped from him and went to the second place finisher, Carl Lewis, who we see over here. Another personal anecdote. I actually met Ben Johnson once at the track at Florida State University. I was down there for spring break with the track team, with my Olympic athlete coach. He knew Ben Johnson, so we got a team picture with him. In any case, enough about me. So we have the Olympics there in 1988 in Seoul. 4 years later, they were held in Barcelona, Spain. Again, a magnificent setting for the Olympics. And then in 1996, we were getting ready for the Centennial Olympics, the 100th anniversary of the reemergence of the Olympic Games. Everybody, or many people, thought that those games should be held in Athens, right? Where do they end up being held? Atlanta. Atlanta. They have the same 2 letters. Maybe somebody got confused there. But the Centennial Games do end up being held in Atlanta, Georgia. These were the Coca-Cola Games in many ways, because Coca-Cola sponsored a lot of what was going on there. But they were games that were also notable for some athletic achievements. You had Michael Johnson setting world records in the 200 meters and the 400 meters. And, of course, the controversy surrounding the Olympic Park bombing that occurred there. A improvised explosive device goes off at the Olympic Park. Several people are wounded. A security guard named Richard Jewell, who at first is hailed as a hero, is then accused of planting the bomb. His life is essentially ruined by these accusations, by this conspiracy, by this suspicion. He, in fact, was innocent, had nothing to do with the planting of the bomb, but it does add a layer of complexity and a layer of drama to what occurred there at the games in Atlanta. These could also be called the Ted Turner games, I suppose, because he benefited a lot from the games being there in his hometown of Atlanta. His baseball team, the Braves, ended up with a brand new stadium as a result of the games. So by the time we get through the Atlanta Olympic Games, we are looking at the new millennium, the 21st century. The 2000 Games are held in Sydney, Australia. And then, finally, in 2004, the games make it back to their homeland, Athens, Greece. And it is there in Athens where we have that opening ceremony over there. Figures from classical antiquity, from Greek mythology, come to life in the opening ceremonies. 4 years later, the games are held in Beijing, China. Spectacular orchestration and complexity of the opening ceremonies. 4 years after that, the games were held in London, with the very memorable scene of Queen Elizabeth parachuting out of the helicopter with James Bond at her side. The games in London were, again, spectacular. World records were falling. It was one of the great achievements athletically. And it brings us to the most recent Olympic Games, the ones that were held just last year in Paris, with the dramatic, somewhat controversial opening ceremonies of those games that were held on the Seine, on boats on the Seine, and at the foot of the Eiffel Tower, as we see over there on the lower left. The games in the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century have gone beyond just athletics. They have become spectacle. They have become hugely complex events where each city, each host is trying to outdo its predecessor in terms of the number of dancers and actors and musicians, the amount of fireworks that are launched off, the complexity of the arrangements and the orchestration and all of that stuff. The games have gone much more beyond sports, yet at their very core, they do remain centered on sports, and it is the athletes who make the Olympic Games a success. Now, with that said, over the course of the Olympics, the sports that have been played and participated in have evolved over time. In the Paris Olympics, there were some 324 separate events that were held. 43 events held in 1896. You had more than 10,000 athletes participating in Paris, compared to about 250 in Athens at the beginning. And over that long period of time, events have come and gone. New events are added, some events are taken away, some are added just for specific locations, and then disappear from the Olympic schedule. But in putting this together, I did want to highlight some of the more unique or unusual sports that had been competed at the Olympics over this long history of time, beginning with tug of war. From 1900 to 1920, there were tug of war competitions that were held at the Olympics. Teams from different countries would compete to pull each other over, kind of like an elaborate gym class, I guess you could say. The reason why the tug of war competition ended up fading away is because in 1920, there were only 6 teams that were scheduled to compete. Only 2 teams showed up. So it made it kind of an unfair competition. The sport is eventually dropped from the Olympic schedule. However, I think that would be an interesting one to see reinstated. You know, get a bunch of like really burly guys pulling on a rope. It'd be kind of entertaining for at least one time. Basque pelota was part of the games in 1900, 1924, 1968, and 1992. Now, that's a very specific sport. It's kind of, do you guys remember the game Highlight? Sort of. You have like a wicker basket on your hand and a hard ball, and you're throwing the ball against the wall, kind of like racquetball, but with different implements. It appears in 1992 because the games in 92 were held in Barcelona, where there's a large Basque population, so it made sense there. You have croquet. That was part of the Olympic Games in 1900. I'd imagine that was not the most exciting sport to watch as a spectator. Lacrosse was part of the Olympic schedule in 1904, 1908, 1928, 1932, and 1948. Lacrosse is actually going to make an appearance at the next Summer Olympics in 2028. Games that are being held here in the United States. Lacrosse, of course, is a Native American game, so it makes sense that it's on the schedule. Rope climbing was an Olympic event. from 1896 to 1932. Again, think about middle school gym class. How fast could you get up the rope? Now, what's interesting is as I was thinking about rope climbing, last year at the Paris Olympics, there was a new event that was introduced called speed climbing, which was essentially rock climbing on a wall to see how quickly you could get up the rock. And they were doing it tremendously quickly, going from top to bottom in like 4 seconds. That perhaps is the grandchild of rope climbing. Like we see here. You had polo in the Olympics for a bunch of years, from 1900, 1908, 1920, 24, and 1936. And then from 1912 to 1948, there was a fine arts competition as part of the Olympics. Artists created sculptures and paintings and drawings that were judged and awarded medals. The idea was that the artists would take inspiration from the athletic achievements going on around them and would reflect the athletic accomplishments. So what we see when we look at the history of the Olympics is that they are global events, important global events, a time when people from around the world come together to celebrate sport. But they are also tied to global politics, to global rivalries. They reflect the political and social situations in the country that's hosting them and in the countries that are participating in those events. The Olympics are certainly not without controversy, but at their core, the athleticism, the competition, really is remarkable, really is something to be celebrated, to be enjoyed when the games come along every 4 years, or every 2 years, because now the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics are staggered. But it is a remarkable moment, and a moment that could bring global unity. And that is a brief history of the Olympics. Does anybody have any questions? What's that? The origin of the colored circles, the 5 rings, that is developed very early on in the Olympic story. I think de Coubertin has an influence in that. They are supposed to represent the 5 inhabited continents of the world. So the 5 colors represent the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. Yes, and back. Next year, in 2026, the Winter Olympics are in northern Italy, in Milan and somewhere in the Alps. I can't remember where. The Summer Olympics are going to be in Los Angeles in 2028. Mm-hmm. And that's where I was told that the first marathon was held. You said it was actually Athens. Can you tell me about Olympia? The origins of the marathon have to actually do with the Persian War from in 490 BC, when a Greek soldier who had just engaged the Persians at the Battle of Marathon runs from that location back to Athens, roughly about 25 miles, to announce that the Greeks had won the battle, the Persians had been defeated. So that's where the marathon comes from. It kind of is in homage to that first runner named Phidippides. He ends up dropping dead after he spreads his news. But the origins of the marathon as a competitive event certainly have to do with, Boston. The Boston Marathon is one of the oldest continuously run marathon races going from Hopkinton to downtown Boston. It is the granddaddy of modern marathoning. The first Olympic marathon was held in that first Olympic Games, however. The Olympics in general, they are from Olympia because that is where the cult of Zeus was established. But the first modern games are held in Athens. Mm-hmm. Marathon is a location in Greece along the coast of the the Aegean Sea. And what was going on in the 5th century BC was that the Greeks and the Persians didn't get along, and the Persians wanted to teach the Greeks a lesson, so they sent a massive army to conquer the Greeks. It doesn't work out for the Persians. The Greeks end up winning that battle. The Athenians end up winning that battle, and that's why we get the name of the event Marathon. Yep. Yes?
You talked about Jim Thorpe.
Mm-hmm.
And about how he lost his medals.
Yep.
And that, but he died. I don't know how many people know that they have a town in
In Pennsylvania named after him.
And it's a nice little town if you're ever in, there's a
The interesting thing about Jim Thorpe and Pennsylvania is Jim Thorpe was Native American, and he ended up spending some time at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. We can debate the merits of the Indian schools. So he had ties to Eastern Pennsylvania. And after the Olympics in 1912, I think the people of that town decided to change their name to Jim Thorpe. Yeah, so they changed it in his honor. So you can go visit Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, if you're ever so inclined. All right, well, good luck with your athletic endeavors over the next few weeks, and it was good to see you all.